Welcome to the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and the Baha'i approach to world religions and scriptures from the Baha'i and a comparative perspective. I am Robert Stockman, the director of the center, and joining me today is Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi, who has held the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at University of Maryland, College Park, since July of 2012. As director of the endowed academic program, Professor Mahmoudi collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary analysis and open discourse on global peace. She contributes to and promotes sound scientific research on peace that expands knowledge and strategies and explores the role of individuals and institutions in removing obstacles to peace. Before joining the University of Maryland, Professor Mahmoudi served as the coordinator of the research department at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa from 2001 to 2012. Before that, Dr. Mahmoudi was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University, where she was also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mahmoudi also has served as vice president and dean of Olivet College in Michigan, where she was instrumental in a nationally recognized and institutional transformation. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Utah. Today, she's going to be presenting to us material from a recent book that she published called A Faith That Acts, the story of Susan Moody, a truly remarkable story about an American woman who went to Iran in 1909, learned Persian, and pretty much remained there most of the rest of her life until her passing in 1934. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Mahmoudi. Thank you, Hoda, for joining us today. It's really good to have you here on this program, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stockman, and I thank your organization for hosting me today, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about this remarkable woman, Susan Moody. I have to apologize. I had some technical difficulties with the slides, and so I'm going to have to ask Rob to try to change the slides for me, and we can't seem to get rid of the rest of the screen, so you can just zero in on the slides. Anyway, but the title of the book is not the title that I chose for this presentation. The title of the book is Dr. Susan I. Moody's Travels to Iran, 1909-1934, Courageous Odyssey. The book is written for an audience that may have never heard about the Baha'i faith, and it's published by an academic publisher, Routledge. So it won't go into, it stays away from Baha'i language. As I said, it's written for a general audience. The context, writing a biography, I don't think is ever easy because one has to make sure that you stay as true as you can to the individual that you're trying to write about. And in the case of Susan Moody, I have to say there is very little that I could find about her life prior to her becoming a Baha'i, although what helped was a couple of her very close friends after her passing wrote an in memoriam and a dedication to her. And in those two, I found enormous information that I could follow up. And that was very helpful. I, by and large in this book, try to use the letters that Susan Moody wrote to the Baha'is in America while she was in Iran about what was going on in her life, and including her journey to Iran, which was also quite a journey and very fascinating. The other thing that I want to touch upon before I do get into the story is this whole notion of letter writing. Today, with the new technologies that have emerged, especially I would say Gmail and texting and all of that, in some ways it's unfortunate because letter writing is not as common anymore. But letters during Susan Moody's time were a very crucial way of communicating. And through letters, you kind of get a very good sense of the person's who's writing the letter, the person's, if I may say, interior life, what that person is finding important in what she's writing about, in the ways that she's observing the world. And so in particular for women, and I will focus it on American women, letter writing during the period that Susan Moody was alive was a very common form of communication. So if I may say, when you look at the early letters of Susan Moody that she wrote back to the American friends in America, her early letters where she was just getting started in Iran with this huge charge that was given to her to go there, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Those letters are very young in spirit, very adventuresome, but later letters show this very seasoned, courageous, strong woman who has really found her way in a world that was full of turmoil and difficulty. So that's basically a little bit of a background about how this book came into being. Now, Susan Moody was born in 1851 in Amsterdam, New York, which is upstate New York. Her parents came to the US from Northern Ireland. They were Scottish Covenanters, which I think is important in understanding who Moody's family, the early religious traditions of her family. Covenanters were a Presbyterian sect that was established in Scotland in 1638. They had a long history of resistance to the king and to self-promoting clergy class and the rigid religious hierarchy of the day. And they were driven from Scotland and moved to regions where they could worship, organize, and build families and communities according to their own beliefs. They were taught to be a very independent people. So Susan Moody was the fourth child born to William and Margaret Moody. Her father worked as a candle maker and a farmer. I want to remind everyone that candle making at this time in history was extremely important because it was the only source of light. And Moody received her education as a young woman. Well, she was among the young women of the American women of that time who actually started to receive very good education. And hers was at the Amsterdam Female Academy. Now, these academies were established in the US to ensure that women did their part in building a strong country. For the first time in US history, because of these female academies, the curriculum for women's school became the same as those used in the men's schools, such as science, mathematics, philosophy, and the classics. They underwent the same curriculum. These academies were built throughout the United States, and it's remarkable. There's a lot of research done on them, and in particular on the women who eventually graduated from these academies. And it turns out that many of these women ended on going on to becoming leaders in the settlement movement in the US, became a part of various professionals, started schools, started colleges. So this is Susan Moody's background. Next slide, please. You're just going to see different images of Moody as I talk, because I don't have slides of all of her life. So New York State at this time, when Susan Moody was born, was really a hotbed of religious invention and revival. because of the religious movements in that region of the New York state, in that region of the state, New York was referred to as the burned over district or the Second Great Awakening, with new sects of Christianity which emerged at the time. And I would give two examples: the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints, and the Seventh-day Adventists. Other movements from this period included the women's rights movement, headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others. In fact, Stanton was part of this organization in New York State, Seneca Falls, New York, which would be 150 miles west of Amsterdam, where Moody lived. Also, Moody would have been exposed to a very strong abolitionist movement in the state, organized to the end to bring an end to the practice of slavery in the United States. In fact, Amsterdam was known as the Abolition Hole, Hole, a place which had long been a place of resistance and direct action against slavery. Finally, Moody would have also been impacted by what other families in her region would have been impacted by, which is the U.S. Civil War. She would have known families who lost their sons in that war. So that's a background about Susan Moody. Now, her story, as we unravel it, reveals a remarkable woman who was a pathbreaker in three distinct areas. Next slide, please. She was an educator because after her studies at the Amsterdam Female Academy, she first decided to attend medical school in New York City, the Women's Medical College of New York Infirmary, which opened in 1868. But according to close friends, she found the dissection room to be too much and dropped out of medical school. But then she returned to Amsterdam and became a teacher at her alma mater, the Female Academy. And after the passing of her parents by about the 1880s, she moved to Chicago, where her brother lived. And that's when she actually begins her career, and I would say a very successful career as an artist. Next slide. In Chicago, she studied painting and sculpture at the Art Institute, and then for 3 years in the Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. And finally, and this is remarkable, in the late 1800s, she travels to Paris, which was the height of the Renaissance of the artists of the day. And she went to Paris to work under a famous painter, American painter, William Merritt Chase. And she was in his art studio in Paris at this time. And after a year, she returns back to Chicago. Her works of art were shown at the World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in 1893. And she also managed to take some voice instructions at this time as well. And during this phase, she was really quite a successful artist. And I would say if she had continued on this path, her artwork would have been quite popular. Next slide. So it's in Chicago that she meets Ava Webster Russell. She's the one on the far right of the photograph. Ava Russell becomes a Baha'i, also in Chicago, and the two of them become very close friends. Susan Moody is on the far left, and I told you Ava Russell is on the far right. Next to Russell is Mrs. Isabella Brittingham, and I'll come to her in a minute. So she was very active. In fact, at the Chicago Art Institute, she started a publication which is still in print, to this day about the arts culture in Chicago, the palette and the paint, or something it's called. Anyway, the next thing I want to tell you about Ava Russell is, and if you could bring the next slide, is that she too became a very famous artist. You can see her artwork if you even Google her name. Among them is this drawing of Frederick Douglass. I haven't yet been able to do enough research to find out what the relationship was between Ava Russell, why she knew Frederick Douglass, but some sources say it was Ava Russell married someone who was a friend of Frederick Douglass. Anyway, so you see that Moody was really quite an artist and established in a very good and upcoming artist community in Chicago. So educator, artist. The next area where she's the pathfinder is as a physician. So now we come back to Susan Moody. As a physician, we knew that she tried to go to medical school and it failed. But now around 1900, as she's living in Chicago, she decides, for reasons that are unknown, that she would like to continue and go back to medical school and become a physician. She enrolled in the Chicago Harvey Medical School and received her degree in 1903. 1903. Now, she was 52 years old at this time. So she sets up her medical practice in Chicago. And around this same period, she comes into contact with the Baha'i community of Chicago. If you could give the next slide. I was showing this because she graduated from the medical school. But so at the same period, she comes into contact with the Baha'i community of Chicago, and she attends a series of classes offered by Mrs. Isabella Brittingham about the teachings of the Baha'i faith. And of course, Mrs. Brittingham was an amazing teacher at the time, and her classes were quite apparently well planned and laid out. And as a result, Susan becomes a Baha'i. And this is in 1903 in Chicago. Her activities in the Baha'i community, as far as we can tell, next slide, include children's classes. She taught children's classes, gave much of her time to teaching and speaking about the Baha'i faith, although she said she didn't like public speaking before this, but had to do it anyway. She was active in a committee, and here's a picture of it, that searched for the best location and real estate for the construction of the first Baha'i house of worship in the Western world. In this picture, Moody is seated. She's the second from the right, and after her are Laura Pike Barney and her mother, Alice Pike. And the other women's names I can give you later. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into too many of those details. She also, there were some Iranian Baha'is in Chicago at the time, and she decided to try to study a little Persian at the time. So that's how she becomes a Baha'i. So educator, artist, and now a physician. So at this time, while Susan Moody is an active member of the Baha'i community in Chicago and practicing medicine, she had set up her private practice in Chicago, a group of Baha'is traveled to Iran to visit the country, the holy places. And upon their return to the US, they stopped off in Akka, where they met with Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha, obviously eager to know what they observed, what they saw, what the Baha'is of Iran had to tell them, and all of that. They conveyed to Abdu'l-Baha the fact that the Baha'is of Iran desperately were in search of a female physician to go to Iran because women really had no access to a physician. And so it was this was in 1908 that these friends, these Baha'is, American Baha'is, met with Abdu'l-Baha after their trip to Iran. And then when Abdu'l-Baha inquired as to who they might know who would fit this description of a female physician, of course, the name of Susan Moody came up. And in 1909, a year later, Susan receives the word that her services were needed in Iran. And of course, she enthusiastically accepts this role. She doesn't, in her letter, she said, I finally realized why I had to go back to medical school later in life. Next slide, please. Now, this map shows you the trip that she embarked on. So I didn't include from the US to Akka and Haifa, but from, just to give you a basic outline, from Haifa or Akka, she then travels through the Bosphorus, through the Black Sea to various locations, going through the country of not only Turkey, but Georgia, Azerbaijan, and then into northern Iran, and then travels down to Tehran. So quite a journey at a time when, especially in Iran, that part going from northern Iran to Tehran was not easy, as you will see in a minute when I cite passages from her letters. On October 9, Susan sent a postcard from Haifa to her friends back in America, and it read, landed 7:30 last night. She traveled by carriage from Haifa to Akka, where she met Abdul Baha's sister, Bahia Khanum, and one of his daughters. And they traveled to Akka to meet with Abdul Baha, obviously, because Abdul Baha not only would give guidance to Susan Moody and what she was to do in Iran, but then also she was to visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah. Upon meeting Abdul Baha in Akka, Moody writes the following in her letter. And just bear with me. I need to go to the page. She says, first of all, this is how I describe it. Abdul Baha then shook Moody by hand, saying he would speak privately with Mr. Sprague, who had accompanied Susan Moody. She would later note, and this is what her description is of Abdul Baha. His carriage is superb, the stately majesty of simplicity and naturalness. The light of the eyes and the love expressed in the face are so brilliant that it was only by favor of a flood of tears that I would continue to look into them. Now, they would later move on to an outward courtyard, and Moody, with her sharp and poetic sensitivity, recorded its appearance in a letter to Ava Russell. Susan writes, there are many sparrows in the garden. They are twittering. The blue, blue sea is covered with ripples. There is a low fringe of light clouds. Mount Carmel's point is in the distance. What a background for the scene in the garden. When I read this, I almost wished Susan Moody, the artist, would have her easel and would have a canvas and would actually paint this beautiful image that she so gorgeously described. Then she says, and I'm quoting often on her letters, that Abdul Baha's sister sat with them as they spoke of their great privilege in seeing their master. She responded, yes, it means much, but if you treat it as a child, as a toy, it is worth nothing. If it does not benefit our lives, if we do not live the teachings, all is lost. Thus, some come and go away without any benefit. Her emphasis again on action, on acts. And I think that's what's beautiful, because really the Baha'i faith is a religion of action. And Susan Moody seems to understand this very early on in her, after her becoming a Baha'i. That night, she describes that she was very restless and woke up at 3 a.m. to gaze at the stars. Soon, she heard Abdu'l-Baha's voice outside her door. Falling back asleep, it was at 5:45 a.m. she noticed 3 women crossing the courtyard. They were chanting tablets. A small girl came and rapped at the door, saying, "Be ready in 20 minutes." She rose, she dressed, and she went out, and soon stopped and heard the voice of Abdu'l-Baha. And she said, I felt greatly privileged to thus quietly observe the love and reverence of the Eastern believers shown in his, Abdu'l-Baha's, presence. Stepping backward to the gate in the most reverent way when Abdu'l-Baha would walk by, all are ready at his call. So anyway, so this is, her first encounter having met Abdu'l-Baha. And of course, Abdu'l-Baha at this point gives her some guidance. And I want to just cite a couple of those. He tells her, you're going to Persia. At first, you will find things very difficult. The conveniences are not the same. Many of the people are poor and sleep on the floor as they have no beds. You must not look at their circumstances, but at their hearts. They will love you very much, and I want you to be happy there. You must have much patience and try very hard to be faithful. Lose sight of yourself entirely. Work only for the love of God, and you will succeed. You will find much love there. All will love you. I will often pray for you. You are never separated from me. You are a worthy messenger. So Abdu'l-Baha rises after he gives her this guidance and embraces her, and Moody asks if she could return to see him again, and he said, yes, I only send you away so soon because the Black Sea gets cold and stormy soon, and it is for your good that you are to go tomorrow, since the steamer leaves next day, but you will never be separated from me. Now, Susan had traveled from America with Mr. Sprague to the Holy Land and to Iran. And Mr. Sprague went to Iran with her because he became the head of the Tarbiyat Boys School. But again, that's explained in more detail in the book. After this wonderful exchange with Abdu'l-Baha, in her letter, she writes that she pledges to devote, consecrate, and sacrifice all that I am and all that I have and all that I hope to be and to have to thee. All that I am and all that I am, all that I will be, to devote to thee, O Divine Father, to be used in accordance with thy purpose. So very moving, this encounter, this meeting with Abdu'l-Baha. Now, so they set out because of the winter. They set out and go leave for Iran. And I want to show the next slide, which shows her so she travels by boat and then by train. And this is a picture of Susan Moody in Baku, among the Baku Baha'is. All are men except for Susan Moody. I'm sorry, it's too small, but she is sort of in the center. She is like about 2 rows up. And you can see she's the only woman in this slide. And I think that's remarkable because she often, in many of her letters, even in Iran, would comment that she would be the only woman among a sea of men at certain meetings. And, she was always in her Western dress, and but was very well accepted by the men. So then from there, she is now leaving for Iran. And this is where I want to just give a couple of segments of her letters. What is interesting about her letters is they are so beautifully, she was a great writer, and the use of language is beautiful. So here, from Baku, they traveled by land, heading to what is called Bandar Anzali, which is one of the locations on the Caspian Sea. And this begins the most difficult part of her journey, because there are hills, steep mountains, and not very good roads that they have to traverse on in order to reach the capital city, Tehran. It would be a distance of about 220 miles. Moody's first view of Iran in the light of a morning sun was glorious, and she describes it this way. After the sun was fairly high and had driven off the mist, the morning was glorious. The roadsides and fields are just beds of pale violet crocuses. There are mulberry forests, then rice fields, and hundreds of donkey caravans going and coming. And then she says, at about 7 o'clock the next morning, the carriage came. I was obliged to send my large trunk by special baggage van, slow freight, and it will be 2 or 3 weeks in getting to Tehran. We have 4 horses, and the charge is per horse $15 a piece, $60. Besides this, we paid $6 down for post fees. They would stop at various posts to rest the animals, to eat, and to just generally maybe rest overnight. So $6 for post fees. And every time we change horses, 18 times, down for post fee, every time we change horses, the driver gets a fee for 20 cents. Now, see the detail that she expresses in her letters. They have a trick of changing horses between stations to get another fee, but Sydney was on and divided it, giving each 10 cents. So they're keeping track of all these various details. She says it took a continuous yell from our driver to get the donkeys out of the middle of the road, and as there are deep ditches on either side, their drivers are running and screeching, yanking and pulling to keep the poor little things from tumbling into the ditches. And if they slide down, it's a pretty dangerous slide, and it was a very dangerous terrain. But then she describes, Iran in these ways, and this is really after the first 2 or 3 days in Iran. All the hills are softened by thick foliage, except the one peak, whose rocky crown carried in color every hour through the day. In sheltered places, there are forests of wild olive trees, very ancient. Some hardy little cedars get a foothold, even on the rocks. There are many caravanserais, with bazaars to accommodate the caravans. The tea shops are more picturesque with their squatting groups, drinking tea and gossiping. You could never imagine such a gorgeous assortment of rags and togs as these people are padded in. Everything is covered except the feet. So all the way from Anzali to Tehran, she says we become more and more conscious of the great needs of Persia. To bring to her aid the right kind of help to develop her riches. And she talks about that these mountains are full of, minerals, and there's oil here. And what we need to do is to tell our friends to study the language. There is such a need and opportunity to help these fine people. And now is the time. So I read these because, currently in the 9-year plan, we are asked to consider the society building powers of the Baha'i faith. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that aspects of this society building of the Baha'i faith were very much present during the time of Susan Moody, when Abdul Baha gave so much of his energy to the Baha'is of Iran to develop Iran, to help, bring education, bring medicine, bring technology, agriculture, everything to build Iran. And so Susan Moody is a part of this process. Anyway, I'm going to skip around because a lot of the details are in the book. But when she arrives in Qazvin, which is a city in northern Iran, they hear that a female doctor has arrived in town. And this is how she describes her time the next day when she wakes up in Qazvin. The next morning, I was up at 8 o'clock, and just as my bread and tea breakfast was brought in, the women began to come, the sick of Qazvin. They had never had a doctor, would rather die than to show their face to a man. And now, well, all the breakfast I got was a snatch now and then. The next day, I worked from 6 a.m. to 11:15 p.m., seeing patients. So you get a glimmer of what it was like for her at this time. Okay, so now I'm going to move to her arrival in Tehran, which happened on November 26th, 1909. In fact, I think she describes it that year, November 26th was Thanksgiving. If you could go to the next slide. Now, these next slides are just going to show you some images of Susan Moody with the Baha'is throughout Tehran. She says, the great love with which the Baha'is of Iran. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm jumping here. So she arrives in Tehran, and Abdul Baha sends a message to the Baha'is about her arrival in Tehran. And this is what it said. The great love with which the Baha'is of Iran have greeted her, Susan Moody, saying that between Anzeli on the Caspian Sea and Tehran, there were 19 relay stations, and at 16 of these, there were Baha'is gathered to greet the Western Baha'is. So obviously there's joy in this message that not only were the Baha'is very gracious in their way they greeted Susan Moody, but what a wonderful reunion of sorts it was for the Baha'is to see this woman come from so far away. In Tehran, could we have the next slide, please? So as I said, I'm just showing different individuals in these slides. This one is, I think, of Dr. Yunus Khan and his wife. Dr. Khan was a medical doctor. And that's Susan Moody, and behind Susan Moody is Elizabeth Stewart, who I'll get to in a minute. Next slide, please. The Baha'is of Iran, the doctors worked on building a hospital called the Sihat, S-I-H-A-T hospital. And this is when it was dedicated. And here Susan Moody is featured with Baha'i and non-Baha'i doctors and staff. It's the first hospital in Iran that had a wing for women. This was not the case up until this hospital was built. Within a very short period in Tehran, Susan Moody sets up her practice, and she talks about putting up the sign saying that Susan Moody, MD, and the hours that she works, and both in English and Persian. And then she said that the influx of patients was overwhelming. And she saw both men and women. And in one place, she says that Tehran needs 20, if not more, doctors, that she alone can't really handle the enormous needs that the population has. And I think after establishing herself at the Sahat Hospital, she just became very well known, to where one of the newspapers in Tehran, a very prominent paper, actually welcomed her, saying how happy they were that this American doctor had arrived. Now, just to show you another, next slide, just to give you a kind of a sense of what it was like for her. Here she is again among a whole group of men, Baha'i men in Tehran. And then the next slide is Susan Moody with, again, I think Yunus Khan and wife. Yes, and then what I'm going to do now is talk about, if you could bring the next slide. Obviously, Susan Moody was overwhelmed with her work as a doctor. And what she did next was to ask the American Baha'is to send her reinforcements, obviously. The first to come was Elizabeth Stewart, who is the second from the right, seated second from the right. She joined Moody as a very young Baha'i. She was a graduate from a nursing school in Philadelphia, but it was called the Medico Chirurgical Hospital of Philadelphia in 1899. Her arrival literally transformed Moody's life and practice, because she was such a major source of support, not only as a friend, but as a professional. The next to arrive was Lillian Kappas, who is the one on the far right, also a young woman who responded to the call for wanting to establish a girls' school in Iran, which Susan Moody would put a lot of energy into, and Lillian Kappas would eventually become the director of that school. The third woman is the third one to the left, Dr. Sarah Klock, a physician who also was an enormous help and assistance to Susan Moody. But she also assisted in the education of girls, and she taught English to them after hours when she finished with the practice. Next slide, just to show you again, I'm not going to, these are all, the names and everything are listed in the book, but these are some of the people that this group of women, all four women are pictured in this picture. Lillian Kappas is the first one on the left, seated. The third over is Susan Moody. Dr. Klock is next, and then Elizabeth Stewart on the far right. Not only is Moody and this group of women, in particular Elizabeth Stewart and Sarah Klock, practicing medicine from morning till night, but Lillian Kappas and Susan Moody, and with the help of the other women, are deeply engaged in trying to develop the girls' school, which would be called the Tarbiyat School for Girls. And the next slide shows just, I have probably over 50 to 60 letters like this, where Susan Moody, this one is written to Dr. Hannon in Washington, D.C. It's on Moody's dictionary, stationery. You notice on the right-hand side is the English, and the left-hand side is the Persian, listing her practice, the street it's on, and the hours that she works. But these letters were sent to Baha'is in America to try to get scholarship money for students to attend the Tarbiyat school. And this was an enormous task in itself. I mean, I don't know when Moody slept, because the way she carries out her medical practice and works on not only establishing the school, but also writing letters right and left to the Baha'is to get more money and funding is astonishing. The next slide shows how, this is Susan Moody's spreadsheet. She's got the names of the student who wants to attend the school, the parents, how much money they need, et cetera, and who their sponsors are, I think on the far right. And meanwhile, there are no midwives, there are no local people that can help with the medical. There are midwives, but she explains how their approach is not yet, it's not sanitary, it's not quite right. And so she's reticent to use that. And then they also want to raise teachers for the girls' school. And they want to raise women teachers in particular. And the next slide shows one such woman who actually ended up coming to the U.S. and got an education. Qudsiye Ashraf, who got a very good education, went back to Iran, and actually was a teacher and helped with establishing of the schools in Iran. So now I'm going to go to, so you now understand about the three women who Susan Moody brought to Iran to help her out. But I want to just I hope that I'm getting across the excruciatingly, astonishingly hard work that these women were involved in under circumstances that were equally extremely difficult. So she talks extensively in her letters about what it took to get the Baha'is of Iran to raise money and the Baha'is of America to raise money for the schools. She talks extensively about the difficulties that Lillian Kappas in particular faced with some men on the education committee. And this is the first and last time that Susan ever complained about something in relation to the situation with Baha'is in Iran. They treated Lillian Kappas very harshly and would not give her the kind of resources she needed. And she, at one point, really reached a very difficult place where she didn't know how she could continue. But gradually it changed, and she was quite successful. So successful that Susan Moody describes in one place, and I'm going to read it quickly to you. She says, in the girls' schools, I don't know which to praise most, teachers or scholars. By scholars, she means the students. These teachers who were totally untrained have produced great results. This is notably true with Miss Kappas's school. But the same is true of a school where at first all teaching was voluntary. Now they pay a French teacher, and their own native teachers are paid a very meager salary. I attend examinations in this school 3 afternoons, and in Miss Kappas's school 5 afternoons, and without exception, from beginners up to the students who received scholarships from American Baha'is, stood well in their classes. In fact, they did so well that upon graduating the first class, the students in the Tarbiyat school excelled students' performances in all other schools in Iran. And Susan describes this in one of her letters. So now I want to just move on and talk about, we are now approaching the 1920s in Tehran, 1920s to 1925, 24, 25, where things are becoming, there was always persecutions against Baha'is in Iran, no doubt about it. Even when Susan Moody started out in Tehran, she would hear about persecutions here and there in villages and towns throughout Iran. But as we get into the 1920s, things become tougher. And life for the Baha'is get worse. And there's a great unrest. In one of her letters, Moody says there is a great unrest politically throughout Persia, and the beloved Abdu'l-Baha wisely advised only small meetings during Rizwan, the Baha'i holy day. And we all see in how wise such advice is. Any political disturbance is only a handle to create personal trouble. So in 1924, Tehran's streets would spill over in violence. And I again can't go into too much detail, but actually Susan Moody and her colleagues' lives are threatened. Mobs actually come to their homes and to threaten them and to loot and to go in, and their lives were threatened. I won't go into details, but there was an American consul, Major Imbrie, who actually becomes responsible for truly saving their lives one night because he posted some police officers at the home of Susan Moody, and so the mobs would not come and create difficulties for the women. Imbrie ultimately gave his life, and he's talked about highly by The Guardian for his actions in defending the Baha'is. And I cover that extensively in the book. But now I don't want to take too much longer, and I want to pretty much come to a conclusion here and open it up to questions. Quickly, Elizabeth Stuart became very ill, and by the 1920s, she was really quite weak. But of Lillian Kappas, she died of typhus in 1920, and Sarah Clark died of pneumonia in 1922. So you see how the 1920s are a very difficult time. And it is around this time, close to 1924, that Susan Moody decides that she and Miss Stuart need to leave Iran to get some rest, to just get out and have some peace of mind and rest, and because also Miss Stuart was not feeling well. So they came to America, and they, with the intention always to return to Iran. She never stopped talking about that. And in fact, when they arrived in New York City, the Baha'is in New York City gave them an amazing reception at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And Susan traveled from eastern U.S. to the western U.S. trying to recruit people to take back to Iran with her. And she did. She managed to find Miss Adelaide Sharp, who went back with her. I just want to convey to you that when she was in America, the Albany Evening News interviewed her because, she was from New York, she was from Amsterdam, and they interviewed her. And she conveyed a very interesting story to them. And I just have to read this to you because it just speaks to the woman and who she really, her character. She describes how they were returning to America and they had to travel by car from Tehran to Akka, where she again would meet the head of the faith, at this time Shoghi Effendi. But on around Iraq, somewhere in Iraq, a band of horsemen with guns start firing on the car. And this news story, I won't read it, this news story says that Susan Moody described that one of the bullets actually came very close to hitting her leg in the back seat of the car. But she very nonchalantly said, but we kept driving on, and finally they couldn't catch up with us, and so we were out of danger. Anyway, so with Adelaide Sharp, she returns to Iran. And if I could now, Robert, just go slowly through a series of slides which show Moody in different settings with the Iranian people. Just keep going. So when she returns to Iran, she is, of course, older. She is, of course, by the way, this is where Lillian Kappas is buried in Tehran. And now she eventually becomes so weak, and stop here, Robert. She is so weak that she is what Adelaide Sharp describes. She has a stroke and eventually cannot come out of that, and dies in Tehran in 1934. And this is showing the students from the girls' Tarbiyat school attending her funeral. Next slide, please. And here they are at her gravesite. So you can see that not only did the Baha'is show up for this, but the students were there as well. And the next slide, please. All right. So I want to end this presentation by simply saying, and there are no more slides, Robert, by simply saying that truly Susan Moody was a remarkable, remarkable woman. To be 52 years old when you become a physician and a Baha'i, and then to be almost, 58 years old when you set out to go to Iran, to start a whole new life, and we have to remind ourselves that Baha'is at the time, American Baha'is, hardly had Baha'i writings translated into English. I mean, let's also recall that this was a time when there were not that many translated works of the Baha'i faith. But her faith was just unbelievable, and her strength and courage. And Abdu'l-Baha gave her the title, and I didn't put this in the book, but it's Amatul Baha'u'llah, and it's a wonderful title that she received from him. And I want to just finish by reading the cable that Shoghi Effendi sent to the Baha'i world after Susan Moody's passing. Passing dearly beloved Susan Moody deprives Baha'i world of the far-famed pioneer who, through her indomitable spirit, ceaseless services, earned unique distinction. She forged the first link in the chain uniting the spiritual destinies of the cradle of the faith, Persia, and the community of its stalwart defenders in the great American Republic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hoda. That's incredible. I was looking at this last slide.
Yeah.
And comparing it to those first slides. Look at the young women there and the men in the background who are no longer dressed in robes, but in Western clothing with Western hats with an automobile. I mean, it shows you how much change happened.
Absolutely.
In 20 some odd years. And that's the 20 years.
Yeah.
And she played a big role in these kinds of things.
She really did. She really did. I'm sorry. Amatul Allah means the handmaid of the Most High. The handmaid of the Most High. Just so I skipped over that. Robert, you're absolutely right. She lived at a time of amazing rapid change. Yeah. Yep.
One person here asks, well, there's some very interesting questions that we have here actually in the comments. Let me go get back to them because I need to go up. There's the cursor. Find my cursor. One person asked, this thing's getting in my way. How did women get medical care before Susan Moody arrived, and what was it like for them?
That's a very good question. From what I could find out, there was very little medical care for women except through other women, like midwives or other women who claimed that they had cures for things. I don't know how else to put it. And then there were, of course, in certain parts of Iran, not that many, but some missionaries who had set up hospitals. And so women could go there. But, this wasn't throughout the country. This was just in little small pockets. And certainly most women really were deprived of seeing what you would consider at that time an officially educated medical doctor.
Right. And of course, we tend to think of people living to be into their 60s and 70s, but life expectancy in Iran in those days was not
horrible
like that. It was more likely in the 40s and 50s.
Absolutely. And I go into that about the condition of Iran at the time. Very poor country. Very poor.
Yep. Let's see. There was another question I saw here. Did Betsy asks, did Dr. Moody have any correspondence with the Bahá'í Khanum?
No correspondence, but in her letters, she does talk about examining Bahá'í Khanum, because apparently Bahá'í Khanum didn't feel good and asked that Susan Moody would examine her. She also examined a couple of Abdul Baha's daughters while she was in the Holy Land, but no correspondence.
So even on pilgrimage, she was busy.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And she didn't even have much of a pilgrimage either, just a few days.
No, she was there for 2.5 days, literally.
Yeah.
Yep.
And half a day was spread.
She never had rest, Robert. It's so interesting. Yes.
Quite amazing, really.
Yeah.
Quite remarkable. You mentioned the Sehat Hospital. Do we know more about that hospital, where it went, what became of it?
I can't find anything about. I mean, I'm limited. I can't get into the archives in Iran. And what I've tried to gather, I just can't find much about it.
Yeah, and I haven't seen much in Star of the West, which is what I was sort of curious about.
A mention is made of it. A picture, the one that I showed you, is in there. But beyond that, I couldn't find much more.
I gather that while she was in Iran, she was, in a sense, treated as an honorary man because she was able to hang out with the men, shall we say, and with the women. I was wondering if you could comment more about that.
Well, I think, I almost wish, Rob, I could go back and see what it was like culturally. But clearly, because she was an educated woman from the West, just her appearance would set her apart, right? And so, as you said, she would be viewed as, I don't want to put it this way, just another woman. I mean, that sounds horrible, and I'm the last to want to say that. But she would be thought of as someone who could be in a meeting. Well, I know why. One of the biggest reasons is the cultural factor, right, which is Iranian women. I mean, there were strict norms to adhere to, although the Baha'is within their homes didn't, the women didn't cover their faces. They interacted with men freely and all of that. They didn't have those similar customs necessarily, but there were those customs. And so Susan Moody sort of stands outside of that custom. And I think that explains somewhat why she was so readily accepted, plus the fact that, Abdul Baha introduced her to the Persian Baha'is, told them that she's there to do the work.
Yeah.
So I think that too. Yeah. But it's the cultural norms, I mean, though I want to just say something very quickly about that. In many places, the Baha'is had to veil, the Baha'i women had to veil themselves in the Middle East, because not to do so would be too shocking to the public. And that's just not the way Baha'is work. We want to respect customs, but that doesn't mean we have to adhere to them in our own privacy, in our own private life.
Right. You mentioned in the book Ta'ere Khanum, or Ta'ere Khanum, I've seen it spelled both ways. She was quite a remarkable Baha'i, and there's a picture of her with Susan Moody in one of your slides, where you can see her hair is about as long as mine, about as long as yours, I think. And that, of course, itself is a shocking
statement. She was kind of a rebel. I really like her spirit. She was a journalist and a very good one, and suffered a lot because she was a woman. And I think her appearance reflects that. There's kind of a resistance, a rebellion there. Very well educated, came from a very good Baha'i family. And yes, I speak a little bit about her in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we know what more do we know about the development of the Tehran community at this time? I mean, she seems to have played a pretty important role. Susan Moody seems to have played a pretty important role in the continued development, the social and economic development, at least the social development, but even perhaps the economic development, because after all, medicine really, improving people's health improves their economic condition as well.
Right. First of all, I think some of the most elite of the elite in Tehran visited Susan Moody in her practice. We know for a fact that at the Tarbiyat school, some of the most elite of the elite students, the children of the elites, attended the Baha'i schools. So obviously, in these ways, Susan Moody was very much engaged with not only the social but the economic development of the country. And what was there was something else did you?
Well, it was just the social and economic development of the Baha'i community as well.
Yeah. And I think there, because Abdul Baha was so keen on Baha'is getting involved, as I said, I consider it a form of society building of that time. Abdul Baha was keenly anxious to get the Iranian Baha'is to really develop Iran as a country. And I have to say, I think they did a remarkable job in that area, the Baha'is of Iran. They truly, I mean, someone should write this history, but I mentioned not only medicine, education, but agriculture, introducing new technology, architecture. I mean, one can go on and on about the contributions of the Baha'i community to Iran. And it really started, I mean, Susan Moody's time was very much the height of this development.
Yep. I mean, even introducing showers.
Exactly.
That the Baha'is were important in introducing that because they couldn't go to the public baths.
That's right.
They were already considered unclean.
That's
and
right.
Make the baths unclean. So, and of course, the Akdas says to wash in running water. So,
right. No, and I think the secret of divine civilization must have been extremely helpful to the Baha'is, because Abdul Baha said, "Why shouldn't we bring good ideas from the West? Why shouldn't we copy good ideas from the West?" And I think when you mentioned the showers, that was introduced by the Baha'is. Yeah.
Could you hold up your book again so people could see the cover and repeat the title, because people are asking?
Sure. Is that good enough?
That's good.
So Dr. Susan I. Moody's Travels to Iran, 1909-1934, Courageous Odyssey.
Right. And people have been commenting about how expensive it is, but it's also worth mentioning that you can get an electronic copy of it much less expensively.
Yes, I checked on Routledge, Rob, before coming on. It's now down to, I think, $32.
Ooh, I spent more than that. That's good to know.
No, I just went to the Routledge publication site.
Good.
Yeah. So once it has been sent to a bunch of libraries and other places, it will keep coming down.
Yeah, they'll probably put out a paperback at some point once the hardcover has covered its necessary expenses.
It is. And I'm sorry about that, but my aim was, I think the world needs to hear the stories of these Baha'is. And I think to put it in the mainstream of publications is important. So I apologize for the price, but I hope that now at $30, it's doable.
Yeah. Now, one of the comments I've wondered about is exactly that, the question of audience, and sort of what changes to the story did you make in order to accommodate a more academic, non-Baha'i audience? Could you describe that a little bit to people?
Yes. First and foremost, I really stayed away from Baha'i jargon. Secondly, I tried to explain the Baha'i religion in a way that someone who has never heard about it or might not want to even go into more detail about it would understand it. And the part that I'm most pleased with, and I had to spend a lot of time on, was when I described the ongoing Baha'i persecutions in Iran. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't understand that, you can't understand why Susan Moody would be attacked and why Baha'is were attacked. So I went, it wasn't apologetic, it was very factual. And I think that's extremely important for those who don't know about the history of the Baha'i faith to understand.
Yeah.
And then the other part was simply that, to be truthful and sincere about this woman's love of this new religion that she had discovered, and I think she expresses it better than anyone in her own words.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned in the preface was your use of sort of thick description, or at least the possibility of thick description. I was wondering if you would comment more about that.
You mean the of her life?
Yeah. Well, and context, basically the thick description of the context.
Yeah, because when writing, I mentioned this in passing quickly at the beginning, but there's a lot of good literature that has come out about when you write a biography about someone, how it's not enough to just convey the information you have. You have to dig a little deeper, be a little bit thicker, if you will, in your analysis of that person. Yeah. What was their environment like? I mean, let me tell you the parts where I described the town of Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. I mean, I drove to Amsterdam on one of my trips. I wanted to see where she lived. I wanted to see the town today. But looking at the history of Amsterdam, and when she lived there, it was a village. Mm-hmm. She came in touch with American Indians, and not in a negative way. They were living kind of side by side, She knew about the racial problems, slavery, civil, those things, her parents being Covenanters. Those are the analyses that one has to get into to describe this person that you are writing about. It's not enough to just say she did this, this, and this, but who was she? What made her who she was? Because it wasn't just her alone. She came from some environment, family, culture, time, place, etc.
Yep. One person, Christine, has asked whether you were able to find examples of her artwork.
Yeah. Oh God. Do you know that's a project that's still going on? I have found old images on the internet of her paintings in black and white, unfortunately. And I talk about their titles and all of that in the book. I have approached the Illinois State Women Artists Organization. They know of Moody. They have a list of her artworks. They were happy that I was doing this work and want a copy of the book. But I have yet to find the actual physical paintings. But I haven't stopped looking.
Mm-hmm. So there's the possibility they may still exist. I wonder if they were sold. I wonder if they were sold to people, or
I have no idea. I even heard about one Baha'i community had met her nephew, nephew a few times over. And I've tried to find him, and I've tried every way I can, and I haven't succeeded yet. So I'm even trying to see if I could reach the family.
Yeah, the family could very well have it as well.
Yeah, but she must have been an amazing artist, I have to say. I think she could have made a career just out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, not a lot of American women were traveling to Paris and getting training in Paris at that time. I mean, there were dozens, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I have an image of her passport, which is on online in Ancestry.com. And it says she's 5'5" and has gray eyes. So she wasn't even this, you can't say she was this tall and huge presence of a woman,
Yeah. But she had great hats, as
I
women
agree.
always did in those days.
I agree. And my favorite has to be the picture of her with the men in Baku. And she's the only one in the middle. It's like looking for Waldo. Where's
Yes.
Waldo?
Yes,
Anyway.
that's very true. That's very, very true. I don't see any more comments,
All
and
right.
I don't we'll be getting any more, so we can wait and see if anything else comes in. But
Okay.
it's really been a fascinating presentation, and I'm very grateful. You've done a good job of taking a relatively thin quantity of information and really making it come to life as a story of a really remarkable woman, and one who we will, I think, always remember for centuries.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Rob. Thank you. It was a joy doing this work.
Yeah, I can imagine that it was. I really can.
Very good.
Well, I think that's pretty much it today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming.
Okay.
That's it today for the Corinne True Center for Baha'i Studies. I hope that you can join us on Sunday, February 2nd, when Mr. Ted Brownstein will be talking about race unity in the Torah. Also, if you're members of the book club, you will be able to participate in a webinar next Sunday with Robert Weinberg in Great Britain, talking about his book about, what's her name, Lady Bloomfield. So that's two things that are coming up soon. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye for now.